Welcome everybody to the G20 Interfaith Forum webinar on human trafficking. We hope this is the first of two webinars this year to focus on this issue. It's 25 years since the drafting of the Palermo Protocol, and this seemed a very good time to reflect on the success and challenges of the work to prevent modern slavery during this period, and what we might expect from future policy and practices. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to thank the President and Vice President of the G20 Interfaith Forum, Professor Cole Durham and Professor Catherine Marshall, for their commitment and support on this issue and for hosting this webinar. Today, I'm joined by four individuals who've worked and had a lot of experience on this issue for actually decades, and to hear what they have to say both on what has happened previously and what we should expect in future, I think is a huge opportunity to understand, for those of us working in this area, for those who understand what is coming ahead. First of all, we're joined by the Right Reverend Dr. Alistair Redfern. Alistair was Bishop of Derby in the UK from 2005 to 2018, and a member of the House of Lords from 2010 to 2018. He has expertise in the fields of theology, church history, social justice, clergy training, leadership and spirituality, and was the Church of England spokesperson for international development. Bishop Redfern sat on the Joint Parliamentary Select Committee for the drafting of the Modern Slavery Bill and supported legislation through Parliament until the royal assent of the Act in 2015. He has authored various books, including Slavery and Salvation in 2020. Alistair is a trustee of GSN, the Global Sustainability Network. Also joining us is Reverend Sarah Duggan. Sarah is an Episcopal priest who serves with the Associate Director at St. John's Episcopal Church in DC. For the past 25 years, she has taught corporate law and constitutional law and courses in corporate social responsibility and business and human rights at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law. Sarah served as Vice President and General Counsel of Amtrak and as Chief Counsel of the University of Pennsylvania Health System. She was a partner at a DC law firm where she litigated complex criminal and civil cases. The Reverend David Schilling. David is a senior advisor to the Interfaith Center of Corporate Responsibility, which he joined in 1994. He serves on the steering committees of the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment and a member of the UN Global Compact Expert Network. David was regional advisor to the Institute of Human Rights and Business. He's a United Methodist minister and worked closely with Cesar Chavez, building support within the religious community for farm workers. Kevin Highland, OBE, and Kevin co-chairs the Interfaith Forum Working Group on Human Trafficking. Following 30 years in policing, including leading London's Human Trafficking Unit, in 2014 he was appointed UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. He authored and led inclusion of Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 to eradicate human trafficking within United Nations 15-year strategic priorities. In 2018, Mr. Highland was elected Ireland's representative to the Council of Europe Independent Group of Experts on Trafficking. And in 2018, he was co-recipient of the Path to Peace Award in New York. He is visiting professor at St. Mary's University and was instrumental in establishing the Santa Marta Group, a high-level partnership between law enforcement agencies, faith groups, and civil society, launched by Pope Francis at the Vatican. I will introduce myself a little later. But what I would like to mention is please put questions in the chat, even during the discussion. And we will have a Q&A at the end, which hopefully will be around 25 to 30 minutes. I'd now like to ask Kevin Highland to say a few words about our discussion today and to frame the purpose of choosing this particular topic.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you for those introductions. And can I also thank the Interfaith Forum G20 group for arranging this very important event. The purpose of this event, as you said, Duncan, is we're reflecting on 25 years of a UN Palermo Protocol, which was the idea of that was to suppress and eradicate exploitation of people who are traded and sold in various ways, which is contained in various legal frameworks around the world. And those legal frameworks are domestic, regional, or international. But the program goes back much further to that. The program goes right back to 1930, when the Forced Labour Convention by the ILO was introduced. So we're approaching 100 years on from the first times that we wanted to fight this. And what is startling is that in those legislative frameworks, particularly the 1930 Convention, the 1957 Convention, and the 2014 protocol that came in from the ILO, it says as soon as possible. It talks about urgency. It talks about immediacy of eradicating or dealing with this issue. And 100 years on, we're in a position where this crime affects 50 million people worldwide and creates 236 billion US dollars for criminals. And if we look at the statistics coming out of the US State Trafficking in Persons report, which is provided, the details are provided by various governments around the world. If we look last year, the total of people identified around the world who were trafficked victims was 134,000, which against 50 million is a very small number. And the prosecutions were at 18,700 and convictions at 7,100. And we may hear, that it's not working very well in places elsewhere in the world. But of the areas, the worst performing area is the Western Hemisphere. So from the bottom tip of Argentina to Canada and the Caribbean in between, there were 18,292 victims identified, which is the lowest number of any region. The next being Africa, where there were 22,000. So we need to start having some honesty. We need to start having some real deep looks at the policy and the practice. And of course, faith is about honesty. It's about accepting the truth and looking for ways that we need to change or the way that we need to implement. So this is all based on us looking at where does the G20 play a role in that? Having responsibility for 80% of the world's economy and population, having enormous influence around the governments involved, because the G20 includes the EU and the African Union. So the countries it represents is over 100 countries. How can we bring change at the G20 level to start to see a reduction, a suppression of this crime? Because at the moment, it's increasing. More victims, more suffering, more money for criminals, more impunity. They're the things that we want to change. So Duncan, that's where this framework is coming from. And what is it that the G20 and its partners, particularly from faith leadership, what can we do to bring change so that implementation becomes every day in every part of the world and becomes the norm? So this becomes a crime that you choose not to do, but if you choose to do it, you're likely to face justice. And if you are unfortunately a victim of this, you are going to be provided with support. So thank you, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I will now talk for 5 or 6 minutes on the fishing industry as an example to understand better the challenges, but also some of the successes. For myself, 15 years ago, I founded and until recently ran an NGO called Liberty Shared, working both on anti-sex trafficking and forced labor. I successfully petitioned for the ban of palm oil from Malaysia and sugar from the Dominican Republic entering the US, and was one of the individuals responsible for introducing anti-money laundering processes into the banking industry to combat human trafficking. I work quite closely with the International Transport Workers Federation on the issue of fishing industry and petitioned against the Irish fishing industry for issues of forced labor and trafficking in their practices. I was previously general counsel and head of compliance at 2 of Asia Pacific's largest investment businesses, and prior to that worked on supply chains between China and the UK. Now, I'm going to use the fishing industry. Not that this session is about the fishing industry, but it provides and offers a lot of examples of the challenges and successes that we see in a lot of other work to combat modern slavery. Going back to the Palermo Protocol 25 years ago, the first issue that came in an effort to combat abuse in the fishing industry was simply understanding the nature of the abuse. And as we look back and reflect, we see that two things occurred. One is that the individuals in the communities that were being recruited by organized crime and by very local coordinated criminal activities were very aware of what was happening to them. It was their lived experiences to find work, to migrate to places, and many of those people obviously were unfamiliar with the fishing industry. At the same time, that sort of structured work or formal work to understand that required the initiation of grant procedures, formal study, research, and publication, which perhaps did not necessarily lead to the policy change needed, and then rarely to actual criminal justice outcomes. We just haven't seen that, as Kevin just said. So we suddenly, and looking back, had this parallel track of survivor experiences and more formal research, both within civil society and within academia. And that these things didn't necessarily come together. And often the challenge has been is to think about where there's a conflation and coordination between the knowledge that comes from speaking to workers and understanding what they experience and the more formal processes that exist within a sort of development framing. The second issue has just been detection, is that once workers are on vessels, they're obviously isolated, often thousands of miles out to sea. And we see isolation in other industries as well. Workers held in factories, workers held on plantations. And whilst they aren't necessarily actually physically restrained, the geography and the structure of the manufacturing or the production is created in a way that prevents them from communicating with others or necessarily physically leaving that site. And nowhere is that more profound than on a fishing vessel, thousands of miles at sea. The work to actually detect it then becomes very, very difficult. And so what we've seen over 25 years with a successful example, like as some of you will know, Ian Urbaner's Outlaw Ocean project, which is heavily sponsored and supported deep investigative journalism, producing both book, film, articles, and a range of materials to both persuade policymakers, but also to provide much greater transparency, shining a light on these practices. But those activities and those projects like Ian's project are very limited in number. The second thing we have seen particularly in the 2010s was this growing use of satellite technology, and organizations like, and I say like because there are very few of them, Global Fishing Watch, who probably leads the work in this, using satellite imagery and then data analysis, increasingly bigger data sets, on understanding the behavior of fishing vessels and the support vessels that come with them, bringing crew out there, taking product away, all under the cover of perhaps being a small dot in a vast ocean. At the same time, what was discovered then is that vessels deliberately turn off their transponders, the signals that identify them, to ensure that they can't be identified very easily. And so there becomes this cat and mouse game between the satellites, the analysts, and the vessels themselves. We also have an increasing number of people boarding vessels and becoming on-vessel monitors at sea, which is incredibly dangerous work. Kevin was telling me of a discussion he had with a young man who does this work boarding vessels at sea. And the crew themselves obviously do not want these monitors there and make it hard for them to both just simply ascend the vessel on a rope ladder going up the side of the ship. And then once they're on there, of course, there is danger of violence to them. So first we have learning of the problems, listening to the workers, marrying the work we have done academically and in terms of listening to the lived experience of the workers. Then we have the issue of actually detecting, identifying where the vessels are on an ongoing basis. The third is that we've had fewer mechanisms of accountability for those committing abuse. Now, these fall into two kind of general buckets. We should always think of accountability for the individuals actually committing the abuse, the physical harm, the coercion, making those threats, and of course those people in that chain that recruits the individuals and brings them onto those vessels. The same applies to individuals in factories, individuals on plantations in industrial agriculture. The second group are those who benefit from this, and those who are making money from it, as Kevin already alluded to, the profiting of it. On the first side of how do we hold individuals accountable? Well, the first thing, as we know, is that they're at sea. So how do we actually identify them and then in some way arrest them or prosecute them? Because they will use ports where they might be able to simply avoid law enforcement or unfortunately have paid law enforcement off at a local level. The second then is what mechanisms are there to hold the actual charterers of the vessels accountable. And we've seen some successes with US Customs and Border Protection who have banned seafood caught from particular vessels from entering the country. Now, whilst that doesn't hold the vessels accountable, there is no prosecution, it does have an economic impact into those people that are benefiting from it, and ultimately makes the work itself much more high risk. But what we haven't seen, as Kevin said, are prosecutions. And that's an important element to remember, considering the size of the industry and the millions of people that are involved in working for it. On the benefit side, who is benefiting? Well, clearly the vessel owners, but then also the organized criminals. And we discussed the lack of prosecution, but then the wholesalers, the retailers, the restaurant owners, and the investors. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Reverend Sarah Duggan and from Reverend Darren Schilling on both the issues of corporate accountability and the investor responsibility. But we've yet to see cases where benefits accrued from those industries have been returned to workers. And finally, there are then structural issues that are in the detail of the fishing industry, and we think about the same details that exist in the production of industrial agriculture and the production of commodities and goods. There is in relation to the fishing industry, the law of the sea and maritime law. And what we know is that vessels can be flagged, for instance, in countries such as Mongolia, which are completely landlocked. And what we need is to understand how we can change some of the structural aspects of the shipping industry and the fishing industry in particular that help us actually start to prevent workers from being abused on vessels. The final point I will leave you with is that very recently, I think it was in 2021, the US Coast Guard finally put IUU fishing, of which the issues of forced labor are part of, as their #1 risk. And it was something that I and a small number of people worked on. Because to get actual resources to the vessels, the fishing vessels in the ocean, you need those kind of assets. And they are rare. The US Coast Guard happens to have such assets in their vessels and particularly their fleet of cutters. And so having them suddenly take that on board suddenly makes a huge difference. So hopefully, just setting out this case study, you can see some of the areas of success and challenge. And I will hand this over now to Reverend Sarah Duggan to expand more on corporate accountability and corporate responsibility.
Thanks very much, Duncan, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for inviting me to participate. I'm honored to be here today with colleagues who've given so much of their lives to the work of eradicating modern-day slavery and seeking justice for victims. Forced labor in global supply chains, as Duncan and Kevin have said, it's really very different than sex trafficking because the businesses at the pinnacle of these chains are almost always respected, publicly traded companies, and we need the goods and services they provide. but we also need to hold business and business people accountable for the human suffering in global supply chains. So to move forward effectively, it does help to know where we've been. Kevin mentioned the ILO convention first in 1930. Many important developments have happened since then, but I think three have been especially significant in building a business accountability framework: the UN Global Compact, the Principles for Responsible Investment, and the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So I'll talk briefly about these three and then close with a few observations. As Duncan said, 2000 was a watershed year. In addition to the adoption of the critical Palermo Protocol, then Secretary General Kofi Annan charged a working group with creating a global compact of shared values and principles, and that group produced the UN Global Compact. The Global Compact offers membership to businesses and other entities that commit to support 10 sustainability principles pertaining to human rights, to the environment, to anti-corruption, and most importantly for us today, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor and the effective abolition of child labor. The compact has approximately 20,000 businesses and 3,800 non-business members. 5 years later, as a result of the efforts of another group of investors who again gathered at Secretary General Annan's invitation, the UN announced its principles for responsible investment. There are now more than 4,800 financial institution signatories, and they've committed to incorporating economic, social, and governance criteria, ESG, into investment analysis and decision-making. And the third development took place in 2011 with the publication of the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The Guiding Principles define roles for states and businesses with respect to human rights, and in so doing, they accomplished a goal that had eluded the UN Human Rights Council throughout much of the 1990s. Using the UN's Protect, Respect, and Remediate framework, the Guiding Principles articulate the responsibility of states to protect human rights through the exercise of legal, policymaking, and enforcement powers, while they also set forth the obligation of businesses to respect human rights by avoiding violations and addressing any adverse impacts with which they're involved. These three are not legally enforceable, but they've had important positive impacts on our understanding of business accountability for forced labor and global supply chains. First, by clarifying the responsibilities of government and business with respect to human rights and highlighting the importance of incorporating social and environmental factors into investment decisions, they've helped forge a social consensus. Businesses need to be held accountable for what's happening in their supply chains. And second, they articulated the principal themes of our emerging legal regimes: transparency, due diligence, remediation, as well as the importance of non-financial factors in investment decisions that influence entire markets. These themes are reflected in the laws such as the 2012 California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, the UK's 2015 Modern Slavery Act that Bishop Redfern, you were so engaged in helping to pass, Australia's 2018 Modern Slavery Act, and perhaps most recently, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that the European Parliament enacted this spring. And there are many others. All of these things, voluntary agreements and guidance documents, are critical components of the multifaceted approach necessary to eradicate modern slavery. And the legal regimes that they've helped to shape are really promising. But I think we need more for at least two important structural reasons, because as Duncan's identified, the structural reasons are so important. First, most businesses that operate on a global scale are corporations or similar legal entities whose owners enjoy broad liability protections. The corporate form is the most powerful engine ever devised to accumulate capital, and capital fuels global business. But the corporate structure diffuses individual responsibility in ways that make it difficult to take responsibility within the organization or from the outside to tie any corporate act or omission to a single individual or even an identifiable group, particularly in large global companies. Yet we know that the most effective legal sanctions are those that hold individuals, not just entities, accountable. And one other structural issue is that we gauge the success of companies and their managers almost exclusively by one outcome, profit. And we tie management compensation almost solely to financial return. In the US, we also measure the fulfillment of the fiduciary duties that officers and directors owe to manage their business in the best interests of their shareholders, almost exclusively in financial terms. It's at the heart of the concept of shareholder primacy. Now, maybe this all isn't problematic in and of itself, but when you think about the combination of an overriding focus on profit maximization, diffuse responsibility, and measuring fiduciary obligations in financial terms, human beings get lost in the equation. Without counterbalances, there aren't many incentives to make sure no one is hurt, especially those who are most vulnerable. So the changes in legal regimes are tremendously important, but we need to go farther. Financial penalties are not enough absent a credible possibility of individual liability. And I just wanted to mention a potential model. Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, enacted in the United States in the wake of the Enron collapse, and the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission's implementing rules, require chief executive officers and chief financial officers to sign the financial statements of publicly traded U.S. companies. What if CEOs and other senior officers were required to certify human rights disclosures or due diligence certifications? It's just possible we see a lot more resources going into the process from the top down where we really need it. But we also need to realize that the vast majority of business people want to do the right thing, and we need to make it easier for managers to address forced and child labor, among other issues. 1/4 of global assets now under management are in ESG funds, over $30 trillion. But there's widespread controversy over ESG metrics and associated fiduciary duties. Pension fund managers and institutional investors and corporate managers are in something of a bind these days, especially in light of the backlash against ESG in the United States. ESG isn't perfect, but finding ways to consider social concerns and investment, especially with respect to forced labor, is critical. And there's a lot of good work we can do in this area. Finally, we all need to be part of the solution. As we all know, and we feel, I think, in our very souls, regulation won't do it alone. Everyone who works in a business, who consumes goods and services, benefits from the forced labor of other human beings, kids and adults. My colleagues here today and many other advocates have made great strides in raising public awareness, but we need to do more. There are a number of great tools for identifying problematic materials and kinds of materials from NGOs, the US State Department, the Department of Labor, but it's still challenging for us as individuals to know what to do about forced labor. When we look at the environment, we all understand now the need to reduce, to recycle, and reuse. With human rights and forced labor, it's a very complex task, but I think we need to find more ways to recognize the many businesses that are addressing labor exploitation in their supply chains and to identify those that are not. We need something like reuse, recycle, reduce to develop concrete steps that each of us can take to break the chains of modern slavery. And most importantly, we need to reach the minds and hearts of policymakers, consumers, and business people too. And that's where the faith community, I think, has a particularly important role to play. I look forward to my colleagues' comments on how people of faith can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I now ask Reverend David Schilling to further develop those arguments. Thank you, Sarah. That was great. David. You're on mute, sir.
This is such an important panel. I wish we had 5 hours instead of an hour plus. But let me just say a few things here. And Sarah, I just underscore all of what you've said. You know, I work at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. And I see this panel as being so critical. I mean, it focuses on how, you know, to end one of the major scourges of the earth, the exploitation through trafficking and forced labor that literally stifles the human spirit and kills the dreams of millions of children, of men and women in almost every single country. So this is really an important piece that we need to address and kind of elevate it to a level that is on the top agenda of the faith community, as well as those that are really working to engage companies to embed, not simply have good policies, but embed human rights within their operations and supply chains. Duncan, I couldn't help think of a dear friend who I met it was probably 2017 in Bangkok, as you really went through, which was really great, about the case study related to the fishing sector. Nam, who was a young person from Myanmar, as so many people travel to help their families. He was from Myanmar, went to Thailand, and actually worked in several places, and then got trafficked onto a fishing vessel. And he literally was on that vessel for 16 years. And when the vessel pulled into port, the fish were offloaded, but not the human beings. There were security guards, and of course, if they would have been allowed off the boat, they wouldn't have returned. Horrendous experience. So I actually have a photo of him at my desk, because to me, it's about policy, it's about practice, it's about trying to get more accountability, but it's the human face that motivates me over the decades to really keep going. And he became a leader. I mean, here you have a person that has been exploited for 16 years, not being paid, abused, etc., finally taking a chance and jumping off the ship when it was in port. Instead of going home to Myanmar after he was free from the vessel, he stayed for one more year in order to testify at the court hearing of the owner. So he did not want this owner to exploit any other worker anytime. So, I mean, to me, it's the persons like him that enable a sense of urgency, but also a sense that as we're having this conversation, many of us become experts, but I think the real experts are the survivors who know more than any of us of what the process has been, and then how to address strategy, et cetera, as well as workers who have been abused through human trafficking, forced labor, modern slavery. So I think the thing for me, all of this feeds a sense that wherever we are, whether it's each of the stakeholders really need to up our game, if you will. The faith organizations, NGOs, international organizations, companies, investors, and governments, including the G20, which is so important given the fact that, as we've heard, these are the countries that are most prosperous. So I'll be really eager to hear more from Kevin about that whole process of getting $30 billion per year, 30 that can help to address some of the gaps. But as we move, Sarah, you did a great job of really identifying some of the I would say progress that has been made. Because when I remember the first time meeting with ExxonMobil in the 90s on human rights. And my job, we had a whole coalition of investors, faith-based investors, asset owners, asset managers, Amnesty USA that had some shares in the company, and a trade union as well. My job was to pass across the UN, the principles, not the UN principles because they hadn't been created, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as I put those in across the table into the hands of the company members that were there, they looked at it and you could tell immediately they wanted to shove it back. And the reason was, they said, well, why are you bringing this up to us? Go to the government. But now we're in a period, now with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, there is a clear state duty to protect, but the corporate responsibility respect. And Sarah, I really appreciated you really digging into that, and also that the remedy, which is so critical. So I think for the investor community, for ICCR, we've been around a long time, 20 years working to get U.S. companies to withdraw from South Africa. That wasn't our idea, but Desmond Tutu, who was then the secretary of, the South African Council of Churches, that said, ICCR, utilize your leverage with companies to get them to withdraw. And, in the end, it was one of the, pieces of many, many pieces that helped to bring apartheid finally to where one person, one vote instead of the apartheid government. So I do see that we have made progress on some of the voluntary areas, and I've worked a lot with the UN Global Compact. There is some accountability in terms of the reporting, but we really need to focus on the weaknesses of, the corporate social responsibility. We've used that model for a very long time. And for us as the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, having that in the name, yet we really believe that we have to look for some legal and mandatory pieces that then we can really work with. And as Sarah said, we need to continue to press and do more and provide the guidance documents that we have been trying to do in a number of areas. But I do feel like we're at a really tipping point where the EU corporate sustainability due diligence directive is really, really important. It ended up not where we wanted it to. We wanted the financial arena to be covered by the directive, and it's probably put off for a little while, but it really gives a level playing field. And it's not just supply chains, it's value chains, it's the entire value chains. So we need to really be thinking through how the faith community and people that are working on these issues can help companies take the directive and really make sure it's not a tick box exercise. We've been through that with codes of conduct. And we would, when I first joined the staff in '94, we were—
David, you have 30 seconds left.
30 seconds. A lot of
Thank
resolutions that we're wanting to get policies in place. Well, we need much, much more than policy. We need practice. We need, as Kevin said earlier, the legal, the legal arena where this is criminal activity. So I think investors need to be supporting companies to change, as well as work with workers and survivors on the ground.
Thank you very much, David. And apologies for interrupting that at the end.
Not at all. This discussion will go on for years.
I now ask the Right Reverend Dr. Alistair Redfern to continue the discussion and focusing on both the corporate accountability and his work on the Modern Slavery Act, but also on the important faith-based aspect of this work.
Thank you very much. Sarah ended with a rising challenge to faith communities and what we can do. And David's been pointing not just to corporate responsibility, but I liked his thing about value chains. And of course, that comes out of faith. As Kevin said at the beginning, the fact is that modern slavery is expanding. The number of vulnerable people is increasing. So they're more susceptible to false promises, false hopes. Criminality is flourishing, as we've just heard in the fishing industry, and dodges all the systems. There's limited resources for law enforcement. Certainly in the UK, modern slavery has gone right down the political agenda because it's swamped by issues of migration, which are actually subtly different. So the battle is enormous at the moment. And it's wonderful that the G20 and its interfaith resources might step into this space because so many millions are suffering. This is about future policy and practice. And I just want to give a little example from the Global Sustainability Network of the role faith can play, things that G20 might learn from this and upscale and really develop. So a little bit of history. December the 2nd, 2014, faith leaders assembled at the Vatican and signed a declaration against modern slavery. CNN estimated that the faith leaders who signed represented 90% of the world's population. Well, I'm not sure about, the media sometimes does exaggerate, but, faith leaders from every kind of faith present signed up. Human hearts are saying, we don't want this to happen to our brothers and sisters. Powerful statement. Following that meeting, I and a Muslim colleague and a colleague from the Vatican established this global sustainability network to pursue Goal 8, which is about sustainable work and getting rid of slavery. And what we do, we bring together a number of sectors. We bring together government, business, media, faith, NGOs, and academia, because all those sectors need to speak to each other, learn from each other, interact, and pool their resources to really make a difference. And the kind of people we're in contact with, and this is what faith can deliver and could help the G20 with, is we're in touch with people at the grassroots. Faith communities are in every community. They know real people in real time on the ground. We're also in touch with lawmakers, presidents, senators, whoever they are, and everybody in between. And the challenge for faith is to join up all those contacts around this issue, picking up what's happening on the ground so that it's informed by people's pain and aspirations and what's happening to them, and challenging those who've got power in business and government especially, and the media, to try and do something about it. We've had a general pattern of meeting once a year at the Vatican, at Lambeth Palace, where the Archbishop of Canterbury is based in London, in Dubai in the Middle East, and in New York around the UN General Assembly. And in each of those contexts, we bring together people from these sectors to see what is happening, what might happen, and what the challenges are. Let me just give you a little example. We've just had our London meeting in June, and this is just a snapshot of what faith can be about. The keynote speaker was one Kevin Highland, who's one of our great global experts, and Kevin really set the scene for what was going on and what the challenges were. We had a survivor from Kenya who's on the Global Commission for Modern Slavery and spoke very movingly and powerfully about her experience and the agenda it gave her. We had a professor of law from Washington who's doing a lot of work about contract law and supply chains and how you can refine contracts for both parties to try and push back. We had some input from Slave Check, based in Australia, which is using tech and AI to join up a lot of the thinking and create frameworks that can be followed through and be effective amongst the different operators. We had input from Archbishop Nikitas from the Orthodox Church, Monsignor Sanchez from the Vatican about the faith response and where we were getting to, what might happen. So faith can bring people into a space. I often say people credit people of faith that we're on the side of goodness. Despite all the scandals in our churches, they generally credit that we're on the side of goodness. But we don't have the expertise, and we own that. We're the first people to say, we need you lawyers, we need you business people, we need you politicians. Come into the space of goodness where human hearts can be touched, joined, and try to do something in real time. We have members of our network working, they've been doing work with the Australian government and the Canadian government about their legislation. I've been involved in quite a lot of work with the finance industry in the UK, and I must talk to Sarah about that. And FAST, the UN anti-slavery and trafficking, finance against slavery and trafficking people. So we get people from all these sectors, and faith can bring them together, get hearts to connect, commit, and then see what can be done in real time with real people. Going forward, I think that I would say, looking at the G20 and your amazing potential with your interfaith network and the work that Kevin's heading up around with slavery, with politicians in the world of politics, there's a massive challenge to get slavery even on the agenda. It's just nowhere almost, with migration, climate change, all these things. People are suffering, and we've got to push that up the agenda. With business, I would say it's an equal challenge, because a lot of businesses who were very interested in us when we started are now full of the green agenda. And they're really proud of how many units of energy they're saving, but less interested in the units of people who are supplying them through all the illegal supply chains and being abused and damaged by it. So businesses, I think, have got to really be re-challenged. The media has to be challenged, because lived experience can become a kind of way of patronizing people rather than helping learn from them and act on prevention. I think faith has an enormous power, because we reach into every community. And quite frankly, what's driving all kinds of slavery is consumerism. And the consumers are us, all of us. We have motes in our eyes, we have it in our phones and all that kind of connection with slavery. But if faith is about the kind of value chain that Dave is speaking about, that's got to talk to real people in real time about everyday expenditure, priorities, getting on the front line for challenging companies, challenging governments, being active citizens. Huge agenda for faith people. NGOs, like Duncan was talking about, have got to become more specialist and focused, because the criminality is so highly refined and technical. And I think we've got a lot of work to do to encourage NGOs and keep them connected. And academia, certainly in my own experience, where in the UK I chair a panel about academic research and modern slavery. We've got to get academic research to move away from wonderful documents that are very wise and insightful to producing stuff that is a working document for business leaders and politicians who can actually do stuff in real time as a result of the research. I think that's an urgent thing too. There's just a few things we're about. I think you guys, the G20, could really upscale that, and it'd be really exciting to see all these important governments hearing some of this message and doing something about it. Thank you.
Alistair, thank you very much. I now ask Kevin Highlandoby to introduce both his initiative of 30 by 30 that David mentioned, and to round the conversation out.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you to the previous speakers for such insights and for their knowledge that I certainly do not have around faith and the work that faith can do and influence. One of the things we have to remember is we're in a world where there are 28 conflicts. Many people are displaced. We have climate change. We have increased discrimination against people. We have the secondary status of women being used as a weapon, as well as the secondary status itself continue. We have child soldiers, we have forced adoption, and many other issues. And of course, all of these situations increase the likelihood of human trafficking and modern slavery. But even when these things happen, human trafficking and modern slavery are not inevitable. As terrible as these situations are, it's an individual person or persons or government or company that actually creates situations of modern slavery. It happens just because someone does something. Unlike other things that happen with displacement, like illness, like the inability to survive because there's not enough food or there's no water, human trafficking has to be a deliberate act by a person or persons. So we need to understand that this is a most serious crime. And even when we talk about human trafficking, we have human trafficking awards. Would we have murder awards, rape awards? We use the term in a kind of a acceptable way when the actual presence of this reflects on the current incumbents of the world, which is us, and the way that we've allowed this to just become part of the norms of society. So in order to address that, I'm going to talk about 6 things that I think have to be done. And the last one that I'll talk about is an important one for this particular meeting. The first one is government procurement should never, ever fund human trafficking. Governments control our taxpayers' money And particularly big governments, G20 governments, they should do all they can and do sufficient so that that money isn't ending up with traffickers. Because if they're buying goods for whatever it is, and that big contract is ending up in trafficking, then countries are actually funding trafficking. And of course, the biggest buyer of services in the entire world is the US government. And I know they are looking at their procurement, but wouldn't it be odd that the country that is fighting this is actually funding it? We wouldn't accept that with terrorism. So let's start to talk about trafficking like we do about terrorism or any other serious crime. Also in that, number one, is business. We've heard from David about the hope we've got with the EU legislation and coming Canadian legislation. We've got some good things in the US, like the Tariff Act, which actually dates back to 1930 as well, but was only started to be implemented in the last 10 years properly. So let's start to take away the processes where a lot of this happens when we're talking about human trafficking and business, because we need to break the circle, the one that allows it to exist. The next is tainted money. You heard me say earlier, 236 billion is floating around in the world, not underneath beds, but somewhere in bank accounts, somewhere in companies, which is actually the benefits of doing this. Some of that is benefits from government procurement and business transactions. Let's start to strip the tainted money. Let's start processes of stripping back that money, just like we would with terrorism. Because if we start taking the profit, not the capital, but the profit, companies would start to think twice, and they would think we cannot endure losing shareholders' profit, because that's where it would come from. So tainted money is crucial. The next one is technology. IT is used to conduct so much trafficking, whether it's recruiting, whether it's online trafficking, where children are abused online from one country to another and do acts, whether it's now, as we're seeing, people are kidnapped and held in places in Southeast Asia to do transactions in mainly English-speaking countries, where they will do frauds, particularly on vulnerable people, creating in one case alone 800 million last year, as reported by the US. So we need the technology companies to manage and police their platforms properly and respond to this and prevent it. They have got an incredible ability to prevent transactions, to identify problems, and to intervene. But simply, they're deciding not to. And they often hide under free speech or that they're not publishers. Well, this is crime. Those highways need to be policed and subject to the same rules as any highway. The next one is international agencies. We need to use those more effectively. The UN, the EU, the African Union, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, but also organizations like the one Alistair leads, the Global Sustainability Network, and of course, the IF20. How can these work closer and more refined on this issue, which I'm really pleased about the work the IF20 is working on, because it is focusing in, really creating a clear focus on what this issue is and where there are opportunities to suppress, prevent, and support. The next one is the international institutions themselves, like the International Criminal Courts, like, for example, the Financial Action Task Force, like, for example, the EU courts and the European courts in Strasbourg. How can we use them to set the agenda more clearly? We need to really be working with those. And, for example, I've already mentioned the World Bank, but how can we use them to set agendas that actually make this crime something you choose not to do? Because if you do, you're going to be stripped of your asset, you're going to take the tainted money away from you, and you're going to be blacklisted from getting government procurement, or you're going to be prevented from entering into trade. But number 6, and that's the important one for this, is the leadership. We need crucial leadership, and that's where faith can play a real important role on ethical leadership. And to deliver these 6 points, I'm introducing the 30 by 30. This is 30 billion by 2030, which is actually, on a global issue, quite a small amount. Because at the moment, when I look across the world, I'm looking that there is probably 1.5 billion invested in the fight against human trafficking globally. The US invests somewhere like 100 billion in the fight against drugs. But State Department last year, it was about 250 million. So a really tiny fraction of what is in the fight against drugs. And this is a crime, this is an exploitation, a human rights issue that we can beat. And over the next coming years, up to 2030, I'm working with the Interfaith Group, with other organizations like GSN and other leading networks like the one David Schilling is part of, to make sure this 30 by 30. So as we move into the next iteration of global goals, there is 30 billion, not in a pot, but being invested by governments in their own prevention, their own responses into fighting, preventing, and responding to human trafficking. And once we get to that point, we will have a serious position that we can take so that we can, as we move forward, start to work towards the eradication of this, certainly in the next decade or so, and post 2030. The thing that I do take strength from is that William Wilberforce, those who don't know who he was a famous politician in the UK who campaigned for the end of the slave trade back in the 1800s. It took him a very long time to get legislation in, 47 years. And, you know, we've been going at this now 25 years. But the only difference with him is when he was fighting it, it was legal everywhere in the world. It was seen as a good business model. Now it's illegal in 93% of the world. We have international conventions all over the place for this. So we need to move to real, firm, decisive action. And without funding, without political will, without day-to-day actions, we're not going to achieve that. So I'm really pleased that the Interfaith Forum is leading on this. And I really look forward to working with them over the process up to 2030, working with all the different countries in that period of time, so that as we move forward, we can say we've played a major role in defeating this awful crime, which affects 50 million people in the world. So thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you very much for that. We have just over 15 minutes left, and I'd like to respond to some of the questions, some great questions that have come in. I'm going to ask first of all for the Right Reverend Dr. Alistair Redfern and Reverend Sarah Duggan to respond to a question that's come in various forms, but I think essentially it's what can people of, and someone used the word normal people, which I'm not, but what can people of faith do in relation to responding to this issue? How should it be understood both from a moral position, a spiritual position, but also just in practice from daily activities? Alistair, would you like to go first?
Yeah. I'm not sure who ordinary people are, but all of us have a role. We're all ordinary in a way. I mentioned a bit about consumers. We're all consumers, and it's consumerism that's driving this in every way, really, fulfilling our desires, not thinking about others. In the UK, we have in a Christian organisation I'm involved in fighting modern slavery, we have a strapline, "We see you." That is, we try and equip people to notice, both not just through purchasing and cheap goods, but noticing people in their locality and what might be the signs of somebody who's being coerced, oppressed, abused. And we do training courses, not just for churches, but through churches into local communities to help people look around, identify what might be going on, how they can respond, and what resources are. And often the police and others will help this initiative that Christians can take in their own backyard, because wherever we are, none of us are very far from where people are being abused and oppressed and probably kept illegally in bad conditions, all those kind of things. So we've all got a role to play in our everyday lives and learning to say, "We see you, we're going to do something about it." I could say a lot more, but let Sarah have a go.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with Bishop Redfern. Just a couple of more things. I think as people of faith, we need to learn. And I think perhaps in the UK, you're a little further ahead than many of us are in the US. But one of the things we've been talking about at my own parish is trying to come up for a model for learning and pooling our talents to figure out how can we learn not only about the problem, because I've been surprised at how many people really don't understand exactly what human trafficking is in the world today. So I think we need to do more learning, more training, and I think we need to do that at the parish or local level, at the diocesan or divisional level, and from the national churches, national denominations, whatever that denomination is. It has to be moved up, as Kevin said, on the political agenda. It needs to be moved up on the faith agenda too. And I think that's absolutely critical. I think we also need to become better advocates. I think in part of becoming informed will help us become better advocates. In the US, we have elections coming, as we do every few years, but it's particularly important now to get our folks to let political leaders know that these matters matter to us, and to try to say, we want to do that. I think the consumer issue is in some ways the hardest, because I frankly am tired of hearing how hard it is to identify which companies are doing the best and which companies are failing to address issues. I understand it's really hard, but I think in some ways we've all backed off from that a little. Not all of you who are working on this, but I think churches can help. We can pool our resources. We're trying to start that out in my own parish to see if we can. We've got several volunteers who are trying to identify, and I thank Duncan for this idea, to identify some particular products and start to look at companies who are producing them, try to learn what we can. So again, I think we want to say, learn, move things up on the agenda at the faith level and at the political level, do what we can to make sure that happens, and start pooling our resources, even if it's in a very small way, to model kinds of behavior that can make a difference.
Thank you very much, Sarah. David and Kevin, would you like to add anything to that? If not, I'll move on to another question.
No, please move on. That's fine for me. Thank you.
So the second question comes in, as a couple of them are in relation to forced labor, and to David first, then to Kevin. Are there any good models out there in relation to production that doesn't include forced labor? And I think the intention here is that, can we rely on anything that is said by companies 100%? And then there's a specific question about the cocoa industry from someone called Bright Deborah Ajayi, who works in Ghana on this issue, and obviously the systemic problems of child labor in the cocoa industry there, and accountability for that.
So should I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. One of the things we're looking at and working with some organizations, is the kind of the worker-driven social responsibility model. So, for example, like in Florida, starting about 2008, 2009, 2010, workers in the tomato sector got together and formed the Coalition for Immokalee Workers, that actually has a system whereby the companies that are purchasing tomatoes, and now it's in other crops as well, they've expanded, have to sign up to a code of conduct that's been created by workers, and that if issues are found, they're remediated very, very quickly. So there's an annual report that people can look at. You go to the CIW, Coalition of Immokalee Workers website, and now it's really starting to work like in other sectors. They're very much a part of a process right now in the UK of salmon fishing, which is interesting, but they're doing it in a number of other places in the United States. And the Accord on Fire and Building Safety, which really came out of Rana Plaza when, in 2013, the collapse of an 8-story building in Bangladesh killed over 1,300 workers, and over 2,500 were injured. It has formed this kind of worker-driven responsibility network where it's now moving to Pakistan, So there are some models that are worth looking at. And I think what the issue for the communities that are being impacted is, how do you sort of scale this in a way that the model has integrity? And if you don't move it too fast, even though there's a sense of urgency, you want to keep the integrity of a program where it's worker driven, with the assumption that the workers are much more right in the fields, in the farms, et cetera, and are very much able to identify all of the issues, whether it's sexual violence in the fields, et cetera. So that's one piece. I think also maybe just a quick word about the cocoa sector. That's a sector that the ICCR investors have worked in for a very long time. It's been there's still some huge problems, and it really stems from the very, very low wage that is paid, or the low price that is paid for small farmers. And as a result, there's a tremendous amount of child labor. There is an organization, Corporate Accountability Lab, that is really done some really excellent work in that area, and just put out a report in 2023 that looks at the systemic issues and what needs to be done. And there's some consideration about tying it to one of the custom and border protection issues in the United States of forced labor and forced child labor through a withhold release order. So there's a lot going on there. And again, I would look for resources like the Corporate Accountability Lab to address that. And they've done some on the ground work in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, et cetera.
Thank you. I've got some examples, for example, in addition to what David has said. But David and I both worked with the Institute of Human Rights and Business. And one of the things they brought in, which was around employer pays principle when it comes to recruitment. Because what was happening, particularly in Southeast Asia, was that many people who were going to get work as migrants were having to pay very large recruitment fees. So some of the work that the IHRB focused on was around the employer pays principle, and was very successful in countries like Thailand, where that's now been made illegal, and in Vietnam, where it's still not entirely illegal, but there is a threshold set, which is quite a low threshold. However, none of that means that there aren't still markets that continue that are illicit and operate under the counter, for want of a better term. But that is a really good example how bringing together business and governments. The Institute of Human Rights and Business used to hold events that David and I attended, whether it's in Thailand or other parts of the world where there may be trafficking, and also then fed it back to meetings that were held in New York and Washington, and started to focus in on the big companies, so your very large companies that would mainly be US based, to get them to start saying, we are not going to do business with you if you charge recruitment fees, and we will monitor this. So that was really effective. And I think another example where Customs and Border Protection in the US was particularly good is one country in Central Asia, main supplier of cotton, and Customs and Border Protection, Homeland Security, placed a withhold release order because of the amount of children that were in that business. And then what happened, that particular country asked for a delegation of experts to go out there, and I happened to be one of those. And within 6 months, they changed their whole production supply from the field to the delivery, so that there were no children and no exploited workers, because it was so important for that country to have the trade with the United States, because that was all their business, really. So actually, there was no sanction coming in, as in you're going to get fined, but there was an encouragement that if you want this business, you're going to have to do it properly. So I think, there is a role for sanction, there's a role for the carrot as well as the stick. But they're two good examples, one which was more about the government, the other was about business and civil society coming together. And I think they are good examples of how things can be moved forward.
Sarah and Alistair, would you like to add anything to that?
I'd just add one thing. I think Duncan thinks that, I think Kevin's point that sanctions are important, but carrots and incentives are really important too. And I think that's one reason it's so critical for us to help ordinary folks like me try to understand, okay, how can I change my life on a day-to-day level in a way that's going to make a difference? And I look at a lot of this stuff frequently, but for those who can't, how can we make that a little bit easier to do? It seems to me that that's a big part of this. And I also wanted to mention that the idea of bringing business and government together, and David and Kevin have talked about that in so many ways, is really important, because I think most business people really are trying to do the right thing. But again, the structure of the organizations, the structure of markets, and even our understanding of information flows can make that difficult to do. Thanks.
Alistair, any thoughts on that?
I think only that in terms of each of us having a role and trying to make a difference, most people, I think, just assume that slavery was abolished in the 19th century. And that's what we find working with churches and faith groups across the UK. So you're starting from a very back foot position. And on the way to getting people to act in the way we've been talking about, I found it's quite important to remind people, what is your faith about? If it really says it's about loving my neighbor, whatever the faith is, your neighbor is this person who you're not noticing, who's crying out for help and you're not hearing. And the only people who can hear and notice are those who are in the locations where this is happening often. And so I think we've got to say that if faith means anything to people, it's not just about going to church and singing hymns and saying your prayers. None of that has any value to me at all, unless it translates into listening to the cries of those who are suffering at the moment, especially those who are hidden, who nobody else will notice. There's a great story in the New Testament about the Good Samaritan, and all the good professional people rush past and don't even notice. And it's the most unlikely person who does. And we've got to be those unlikely people.
Thank you, Alistair. That's a very good way to bring this to a close. We have 3 minutes. There is a question about AI, which I'm going to handle in 1 minute. And then I'm going to ask Kevin to close out the panel. There's a question about what value AI brings. And I think that the reality is we don't know. We don't know what the value of AI is. It's very early to tell. We can look and say, well, there are ChatGPT struggles with issues that when we see AI used, for instance, when it was used in a very bland circumstance to create opening credits to movies and sometimes people didn't like it because it doesn't look realistic. I think we've relied for a long time on sort of filtering models of data analysis, such as Google, and we now have AI where there is some sort of thinking going on in inverted commas. But what that brings to the trafficking issue is very far ahead, and so it's not something that we should be relying on the sort of interceding technology play. It's not a thing that we should rely on this minute. What I would say is that we need more evidence, in that we need both big data, and for those people, big data is large quantitative data, but we also need thick data, and thick data is data of people going on the ground, such as ethnography, understanding what is happening, listening to people, and understanding what is happening to them from their perspective. And both those types of data are important. AI is for something perhaps by the time we get to 2035, maybe, but not at the moment. I personally don't believe, having worked a lot with tech companies and on data provision, that it's a distraction at the moment for those of us in the practice. I'll hand it over to Kevin to close out.
Thank you, Duncan. We've discussed a lot at this event, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to all the people who have participated or attended today. I think one of the things that comes to me around this is the one piece that we can never, ever forget. And I think because I'm surrounded by people of faith who are clerics and have given their life to caring for others and speaking about others, is that we cannot solve this. This is created, as I said, by man and humankind, and it will only be resolved by human kindness. And that kindness has to come in different ways. And as Duncan says, we're not going to solve it by some magical technology. We are going to solve it by us requiring the governments, the businesses, communities, and people to treat our fellow humankinds in a certain way. But that's a big wish. And what we need to do is to be able to create the tools and the culture that tackles all of this at grassroots. And when I say at grassroots, I mean where it happens. When we talk about grassroots, we immediately think about an organization as opposed to the grassroots, which is the people being exploited. And that could be within a couple of miles or next door to where any of us are sat at the moment. So when we're talking about data as well, where is this acceptable? Tell me where human trafficking and modern slavery is acceptable so we can look the other way because it's only happening a little bit. Where is it that we should go because it's big enough and it's a big enough problem for us to care about? And that's why we need to create standards. And when I talk about standards, if I'm driving my car where I live, which is rural Ireland, at 3 o'clock in the morning, my likelihood of passing another car is very, very remote, certainly for about 15 miles or so. If I'm driving in Dublin at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my car will be surrounded by cars and we can hardly move. But the exact same standards on my driving, my vehicle, my insurance, everything is the same because we've created standards, and those standards are applicable wherever you are. With human trafficking and modern slavery, we haven't gone to that point where we're saying the standards apply everywhere and to everyone. Governments, business, faith groups, communities, all of us. And we're going to make sure that those standards are enforced. And most people will apply to them and apply with them. And if you don't, then there may be sanction. So that's why I feel the 30 by 30 will elevate this up the agenda, 30 billion by 2030. And by us all working together and being very clear that everything we do around this is about identifying that person who could be in the middle of nowhere or could be in the middle of the biggest city in the world. And we're speaking and representing all of them. And an important role in that is to listen to the voice of survivors, but more importantly is to act on their advice, act on their suffering, and start to suppress that suffering. And that's why I'm so grateful that the Interfaith Forum is leading on this issue in this way, so that we can start to see change. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us. Thank you to my fellow panelists. And obviously we'll be reporting back on the event that takes place in Brasilia in August and be feeding into the G20 itself, which occurs in Brazil again in November after the US election and after the UN global GA that will be happening in September. So, you know, it's not a subject that I should be saying I'm getting excited about because this shouldn't happen. But I'm optimistic that I've got good partners. I'm optimistic that we have the IF20. And I do hope that we can achieve 30 by 30 by 2030, so that as we move forward into the next decade, this crime starts to become something that's of history. So thank you very much. And thank you, Duncan, for moderating.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I just want to say thank you to all the participants, and was it 80, 90 people for joining us. To the panel members, thank you. And to the G20 Interfaith Forum for supporting this. It's very much appreciated. We will stop here and then more to come later this year. Thank you.